exciting year as we have seen some of these prophecies develop. As a consumer of news, you may have found that there are many commentaries available in our what people describe as our post-modern world. That is, after the world became modern and developed, now of course we've got what they call the events happening after that modernisation. And of course it's very easy to get news feeds, news broadcasters, podcasts, plenty of summary headlines. There's Apple News and Google News, and now we find in 2018 fake news that perhaps present a significant amount of noise or confusion just because of its volume, its complexity, and possibly that's become overwhelming. This evening we invite you to share with us some very pertinent Bible prophecies that have very specific relevance to the year that we've nearly finished. Well, 2018 continues to be, with some, continuing concern in regard to things like natural disasters. That's been a very atypical year. Volcanoes, hurricanes, recent tsunamis have all been part of 2018 as they have in previous years. Global warming, you may remember back to January, Sydney and Adelaide experienced the hottest days ever on record. And of course, those themes are consistent themes in our news and a portent of very, very changing times. And of course, also, probably one of the most socially challenging events this year has been the strength and the size and the speed of the Me Too movement. The social media storm that led to the downfall of some, several very high-profile people who thought they were beyond interrogation for those matters. And of course, including in that is, of course, the events surrounding the President of the United States. But all of those things really form a backdrop to a confused, a frustrated, and a very, very changing world. Christadelphians have held that Bible prophecy are really the tenet and the background or the backbone of their faith for over 150 years in the modern era. And we've proclaimed the wonders of Bible prophecy free of charge from this platform and many platforms, specifically from the time of one John Thomas, who commenced the movement some years ago. But prior to that, and prior to the work that Christadelphians had done, there was other people that also were intrigued by Bible prophecy and its impact. Some people like Sir Isaac Newton, Mark Twain, also his full name of Samuel Clemens, and certain presidents of the United States also shared a strong interest in Bible prophecy, and in particular in reference to the Jews. Those presidents obviously belonged to an era that had some sort of credibility that the presidents appear to lack today. But despite that interest, very few people, in my opinion, come close to understanding the real context and the real development of that, as we consider that the Bible said that Judah would dwell forever and Jerusalem from generation to generation. And we want to fit that into the context of things as they've developed this year. And I hope this evening not to explain every event that's happened this year, but really to pique your interest in some key events as we've seen them develop. And these are fundamental beliefs that have been held for quite a long time, but we have seen development in these areas this year. The context in Joel is very, very interesting, and you might have been, quite alarmed at how much drama was in Joel 3. But I just want to read for you, before we go to Joel 3, a quote from the Lord Jesus Christ. We want to just quickly look at a warning that he gave in regard to the subjects that we've got this evening from Luke chapter 21, verse 23 to 24. And he's talking as he's standing looking at Jerusalem and explaining to his disciples that they would fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles forever, no, not forever, but until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress or anxiety of nations with perplexity, that is, without any way of escape, the seas and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear for looking after those things which are coming upon the earth. And that would have to be a summary of people with insightful look at what's happening on the world, and the concern that they would have. But you see, Jesus Christ was talking about a time when, of course, the Jews existed in their territory, but were soon to lose it in the drama of AD 70 to the Romans, where Jerusalem was completely sacked and burned. And of course, for 2,000 years they lost their tenancy of the land that God had given their fathers Abraham, and of course they were not reintroduced to that until approximately 150 years ago, approximately 70 or 80 years ago. But Joel gives us a broader picture, and actually Joel speaks of a time when the captivity that the Lord Jesus Christ talked about would be reversed. He talks about the time of the Gentiles coming to the full, or this period of time that would start and change global nations and borders and landmarks and ownerships of certain territory. Let's just read a few verses there. Verse 1 of chapter 3 of Joel. Behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. And of course, that's not a case of if I shall bring again. It is a statement by Joel as a matter of fact that God would change and bring Judah back to its territory. And of course, we've seen that happen over the last 70 or 80 years. But he adds to that, I will, in verse 2, I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered amongst the nations and whom they have parted my land. You see, just dividing up the land of Israel gave significant grief to the father, and he said that is going to change. And of course, along with that, went all the problems associated with that and the loss of land and territory by the Jews. Then we go on to read later on in that chapter in verse 9 and 10, proclaim ye this among the Gentiles. So this is at the time when God will return his people back to the nation, back to their nation and their land. And he says, prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, let them come up. And this very interesting analogy, it follows it, but beat your ploughshares into swords. And that's an analogy that means that they would turn instruments of agriculture, hoes and things like that, into weapons and articles of defence. And your pruning hooks into spears. They're the implements that are used to create and produce fruit, and trees are going to be turned into weapons of war. Let the weak say, I am strong. Assemble yourselves, he says, and come all ye nations, and gather yourselves together round about, thither cause thy mighty ones to come down, O Yahweh, O Lord. Let the heathen be wakened, and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there will I sit and judge all the heathen round about. That is an overarching statement of God's intention to bring the nations to a final conflict into the Middle East, okay, and judge them because they had scattered his people and divided his land. And his desire to preserve his people is important in that process. So here's some statements for us to take in their very simplest form. Prepare for war. Okay, that's this statement that Joel is making. It's a time to wake up and wake up the mighty men. That is the re-emergence of great leaders who have one argument or one agenda, and that is to settle old arguments over the territory they believe they have. He says, let all the men of war draw near. Draw near to what? Well, the nation of Israel and its land and territory. Its holy places. It's places that have belonged for many years to the Jews. And then, of course, those other statements. Interestingly, there's this other little statement at the end of verse 10 that says, "Let the weak say, I am strong." And Justin mentioned rogue nations, and of course we've seen some very, very interesting developments in weak nations proclaiming their strength this year. So I want to lead off. This evening I want to only consider three things: some general comments about the nations. I want to deal specifically with Russia, because I think as I scanned news articles for 2018, they became a very obvious theme there. And of course the subject of Joel 3, of course, is Israel itself. And then I just want to end up with how that's flowed out into this distress of nations that the Lord Jesus Christ spoke about in Luke 21, just very, very briefly. So in the next slide. Okay. We've seen this argument sort of go backwards and forwards, and this is described like the rushing of many waters in the scriptures. You know, we've got one leader of the US berating the other as Little Rocket Man, and then a retort coming back about, you know, that any claim about nuclear weapons is the spasms of a lunatic, and this trading off. And of course, I'm going to call this an uneasy silence continues. Yes, I know that Donald Trump has taken a moral victory, or the high road of a victory, saying that all the problems are resolved. I suspect, as you probably do, ladies and gentlemen, that in actual fact that the development of nuclear weapons by the North Koreans is probably still underway. It's just that he's not telling anybody about it or using it as a threat. And so this is the kind of distress in nations that we see. What are we going to do about that? Who can do anything about that? You know, Australia was concerned because, of course, some of our territory were in the range of the missiles that this leader was producing. And so, you know, we saw other articles like Kim warns of nuclear button on his desk as well. So here they are talking and comparing about the size of the buttons as some kind of nonsense threat that happens. And of course, that's very concerning for people. Okay, did it end up in a detente or an agreement? Yes, it did. But the reality is that starts simmering and continues to think. And that really is evidence of, as Joel says here, it's the weak saying, I am strong. They're threatening a retaliation if anybody touches them or their financial or territorial interests. And of course that's bubbled along this year with, I think, an unresolved tension that's left there. Well, that was really the start of our year in 2018, wasn't it? And then there was other things like Mr. Abbas in the Palestinian territory, you know, claiming to Trump, may your house be demolished. Another just about bankrupt country who's since got up in the UN and spoken at great length about this. You know, he's sort of claiming that the Trump house should be demolished. Okay, and so that is the tenure, and of course they've got behind them, they've got media, they've got influences in their particular countries that are generating, I would think, a great cause of concern. And then, of course, we've got a map. This is not a very recent map, but it is a map of really the measure of lack of peace, actually, and the spending on armaments by various countries. And of course, Australia there in the yellow has a very, very low percentage of GDP spent on armament or spent on the deployment of the weapons. Other nations like Russia and America in the middle here have a significantly higher level. Over here in sub-Saharan Africa, Niger, Libya, and Ethiopia here, there's obviously a significant amount of money per GDP spent on you know, their particular challenges. And of course, the tragedy of that for any person on the world is that, of course, the most needy nations are spending the greatest amount of money on military hardware to defend or to promote their own causes within their countries. And that's actually a tragedy, that map, isn't it? as we consider the balance of spending that has gone to that. There's also another very interesting comment that very recently, actually, and a couple of days ago, about the fact that most of the world aid going into those countries is actually benefiting third world countries, but that's probably another story to develop. But that map shows, I think, a sad lack of prioritisation of the needs of their countries, and really a good indicator that ploughshares are being beaten into swords and pruning hooks into spears. What's some of the territory that have been in the news, recently? Well, I want to go across to Ezekiel 38 to introduce this section. And Ezekiel 38 is, a really, really interesting chapter about the development of the great conflict and who the component parts of that conflict are that we've read about in Joel. And of course, in Ezekiel 38, we've seen the great antagonists come together. And the antagonists in Ezekiel 38 are this one called Gog and God himself. So in verse 3 of Ezekiel 38 we read, "Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal." And of course you may have heard from this platform many, many times the extended meaning of those places. And of course in verse 2 we've got Russia mentioned, and this is why we wanted to spend a bit of time around Russia, because look at the qualities, or look at the kinds of things that Bible prophecy spoke about him. Now we can't read the actual word Russia there, but it's when we translate or when we change or look at the original Hebrew of the Old Testament and translate that into English, when we read there in verse 2, "Set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech." The words chief prince there is properly translated prince of Rosh. The word chief is the word Rosh, the one at the top. And of course this conglomerate, or this Gogian power, this prince of Rosh, prince of Meshech and Tubal, aligning with Moscow and Tobolsky, is of course the Russian people. And centred on that is the development of a theme of aggression by Russia and a conglomerate army that is joined together and aligned with other nations in verse 5, Persia, Ethiopia and Libya, all of them with shield and helmet. And of course the development and the growth and the movement of Russia is really what Ezekiel 38 is about. And of course God is watching this, having proclaimed through Ezekiel that one day he would come down. How would he come down? Well, we're told in that, "And I will turn thee back," in verse 4, "and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armour, even a great company." So the size and magnitude is spoken about there, with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. And so Russia becomes a focus for Bible students because they are going to be the leaders in this conglomerate of nations that will eventually enter the land, as we read a little bit later on. But the method in which they are drawn down into it seems almost like an accident, because in the terms of the prophecy, "I will put hooks into thy jaws." And God is expressing his work in dragging Russia and his leaders down into the Middle East so that they can prepare for this great day, this great calamity that Joel speaks about in the valley of Jehoshaphat. And of course, that's what Syria looks like today. On the slide before us, that's been the evidence of multiple turmoils in this nation. Interestingly, it took Syria, who was in a civil war, and then a third party invading them of ISIS, for Russia to step in a couple of years ago and say, that's enough, we are defending, we're going to support the president, or they were going to support the president of Syria. And of course, they were drawn into a conflict that was already in conflict. And I believe that classically illustrates how they were drawn into the Middle East very near to Israel, with a longer term, in their mind, plan, or a longer term ambition to be very close to the northern borders of Israel. So what have we seen this year? Well, we've seen Russia marking its territory and declaring his intentions. Here we have Putin launches fourth term with ambitious vow. Now, that whether Putin is actually the Gog of Ezekiel 38 will stand to be seen, but certainly the attitude of Gog in Ezekiel 38 has the same dictatorial, aggressive, and very ambitious nature of Putin himself. Here he is in his fourth term. He's manipulated the parliament. He's caused his Prime Minister to take over for a little while so he can change laws, and here he is now stating his intentions in 2018. And what is his intentions? I don't expect you to be able to read that writing, so I'll read it out to you. Putin later issued an extensive decree calling for the acceleration of the technological development of the Russian Federation, as though we didn't really know that previously. And, he says, creation of a high-performance, export-oriented sector in the basic sectors of the economy, primarily in manufacturing and agro-industrial sector, which I guess, like me, I'm a bit suspicious of. He hasn't added there at all his main source of income in weapons sales to Middle Eastern countries. But the article goes on to say he foresaw Russia becoming one of the world's top 5 economies by the end of 2024. Now, that might not be remarkable to hear that news, except Russia has been in a serious slump for the last 4 or 5 years because of the effect of oil prices. This commentator goes on to say that that change, that anticipation of becoming one of the top 5 economies in the world, would require boosting GDP by some 50%. So this is a massive ambition that he has. Russia currently places about 12th in rankings of world economies, and of course this pomp-filled inauguration was covered in assiduous details of state television. It showed Putin working at his desk in his shirt sleeves, then donning a suit coat to begin a long, solitary walk through the corridors of the Kremlin Senate building before boarding a limousine for the short drive to the Grand Kremlin Palace. So we are under no illusion as to the ambitions of this man and what he intended in 2018 and beyond. So what did we see in the news? Well, we saw Russian military growing their submarine threat in the North Sea, and particularly around England and other areas. We saw his preparation for war. We saw war games in the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, for Bible students, that's a very interesting statement because we're expecting from Daniel 11 to understand that one of the paths that Russia will use is, of course, via sea, and they have got a large part of their fleet in the Eastern Mediterranean doing war drills, practicing obviously their strategic and tactical plans in that. And of course they did it just to annoy the Jews very near their holy season, and of course upset some flights and incoming and outcoming staff. So we see a preparation for war on a scale that we haven't seen in the last 5 or 10 years from Russia. They have an ambition to do that, and of course away they're going. Russian Black Sea Fleet with destroyers furthermore in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. Russia rehearsing for a global war. This article goes on to say that the series of exercises in a place called Vostok in Russia will likely stress and therefore test Russia's developing capability for mobilising the entire Penelope. Now, the Penelope is the extensive or impressive collection of war units and materials. So this is Army, Navy, it's ground forces, it's support staff, it's firepower, it's all that. And of course, Ezekiel had spoken about a very large army in preparation. And so it's not surprising that we see that in 2018 as Russia's ambition begins. Here they are again with another article that was a couple of weeks after the previous one, and of course in various parts of the world they're expressing. You might remember articles from about 10 years ago where they were saying that it was a rusting fleet of armaments, that their ships were rusting in port. Well, that is not the image that Russia wants us to understand. It is re-emerging, and it's on the rise. And just in case we thought, well, they're land vehicles and that won't necessarily affect us, well, they've also developed, obviously, long-range supersonic jets with high-speed and nuclear armaments on board. And of course, this was happening not on the western side of Russia, but on the eastern side. These were Asian preparations using these kind of long-range, high-speed jets. And of course, Russia was minimising the need to alert Western observers as to what is happening and circumvent their existing treaties. So here is a cunning and a stealthy preparation for war. Therefore, this commentator that wrote this article went on to say there is every reason to believe, along with their Russian war correspondents, that Moscow is rehearsing a global war scenario along with other smaller scenarios that will complement that ambition. There were articles that warned about the possibility of another Ukraine invasion or operation. Okay? And of course, there's the inevitable article, Russia may be telling true lies about its unprecedented war games with China, and it won't be the first time. So understating their capability, understating their real intentions and why they're doing it there. Of course, America responds. You know, and the US says it will take out banned Russian missiles if secret development continues. And of course, this kind of verbal counter-threat to the arms escalation is rather interesting. For those that are maybe a little more senior in years, they would remember it's a bit of a return to the Cold War days. And you might ask, what is the difference between a Cold War and a hot war? Well, a hot war is obviously in engaged firepower on the ground, and a Cold War was a phrase that was used to develop or used to describe the escalation by two or more nations' stockpiles in case of future need in military threat. And so for many, many years, of course, America and Russian superpowers built up a stockpile of nuclear weapons and armaments so massive that in actual fact it was estimated they could destroy most of the Earth 3 or 4 times over. And of course, 20 to 25 years ago, that all began to change, and of course they got into peace agreements. Well, that is starting to change again, and we're back into similar themes that we have heard before. And of course it leads commentators to say, from that, could a new Mideast war be brewing? This is the kind of article that people wouldn't have been game to produce maybe several years ago, but this comes off the back of the kind of intensity of build-up in the Middle East of this great army that Ezekiel has told us about, and along with tension between Israel, its neighbours, and their supporting parties. In this particular claim, Israel destroys, it was claimed, an Iranian drone that had entered its airspace from Syria. Syrian anti-aircraft then took out an Israeli F-16 in response, and then Israel, counter-responded again with one of the biggest air attacks on Syrian air defence in 35 years. In 35 years, that's reasonably significant, isn't it? Because there's been some big conflicts in the last 35 years. And so Israel will strike very quick, very, very accurately, and of course they're looking for that. So 2018 has seen, without doubt, in my mind, the development and the re-emergence of Russia as a growing superpower with threats to various sides of the world, both east and west, and an interest in developing and controlling its southern borders in readiness for the climactic battle that's described in Joel 3 and Ezekiel 38, called from this platform on occasions before the Battle of Armageddon. But what about other nations like, for instance, Israel? Israel, there we go, the Israeli flag flying over Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been in a series of tumultuous articles and focuses ever since the US president decided to put or proclaim the capital of Israel being Jerusalem against the interest of other people like the Catholics and also the Palestinians. And of course he made that statement by putting his embassy in Jerusalem very early in the year. And of course the resonating sort of and the outflow from that caused a lot of angst. And of course it's meant a lot of ups and downs for Israel. Israel continued to remain a stubborn fact of history though, don't they, ladies and gentlemen? Their presence in the land confirms that Ezekiel 38 has come to pass. And we read in Joel 3 verse 1 that God would bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. The scattered nation would be returned. They're still there. They're being supported in different ways. They're being disagreed with in different ways, but they are still there as a stubborn fact of history. And we've seen the nation emerge despite that. One of the interesting things or statements of Ezekiel 38 here is in verse 8 and 9, that we're told of the feeling and the attitude of Israel when Russia makes its great move along with its conglomerate armies. And we read that in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38. After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Thou, Russia, Gog, and its conglomerate armies shall ascend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands and many people with thee. So that Ezekiel then prophesies in verse 10, Thus saith the Lord God, it shall also come to pass that at the same time shall things come into thy mind that thou shalt think an evil thought. And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages, and I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. Okay, so we're told of the approach of Russia, his intentions, and the fact that he is going to consider an evil thought on his journey south. And I want to stop here and just consider those couple of verses, because there's a couple of things that really have been very interesting over the last several years. Of course, in 2004, so many years ago in reality, it was decided that a wall would be built. And of course that's been completed. It's about 400 miles, about 600 kilometres long, and it separates the Palestinian areas, occupied areas, from the Jewish or Israeli areas, both around the Gaza Strip and around what is called the West Bank. It's called the West Bank because it's on the western bank of the River Jordan there. You can see parallel to that is the country of Jordan here, and of course here down in this valley here is the River Jordan, and this then forms the part of the western bank which the Palestinians have occupied in various sizes and communities since that. Well, Israel are sick of having rockets and kites with explosives flown out of that, and and remote control devices and tunnels coming in with terrorists and other forms of military and forgot the word, other forms of aggression. And of course now, now that they've said, well, we'll put a wall around here and we'll block that kind of progression across so that it protects the safety. Now, in some ways that may appear to be contradictory from that. What we're told here is that Israel are dwelling safely and dwelling without walls and bars. And many of us have been to Israel and we've seen that in evidence, even way up here in the north and all down here where the Jews' form of social development is by the use of kibbutzim or kibbutzes, which are communities that are built around a central group of buildings with supporting agricultural, manufacturing and other industries supporting them, but they are essentially unguarded. And the kibbutzim have been a standout way of the development of the community in Israel. And so, in one sense, they have dwelt without walls and bars for some time. But this land is a land of, full of contradictions. It's, in a sense, confident, that is the land of Israel, are confident in its military might, and it still has the support from, very powerful nations like America. It has reduced the number of attacks massively on its people by building that wall. The weekly suicide bombings have stopped. On the other hand, Israel's confidence in their own military might has been shaken by the war that was previously engaged in up here in Lebanon, where the Hezbollah came down and fired rockets into Israel. That was in 2006, so quite some years ago. But on that occasion, of course, Hezbollah was not defeated, and this led Israel's enemies to believe, perhaps for the first time, that they could actually beat and destroy Israel in an all-out war. Well, we see Hezbollah and Hamas continue to mass missiles for the next round of hostilities. So we have confidence on the one hand, or they have confidence, on the one hand, and yet on the other it's clearly misguided and there's a sense of foreboding as well. In Ezekiel 38, we've read that Israel dwelling safely at the time that the northern Russian nation or conglomerate forces an invasion. Verse 8, we've read that many days Russia will be visited. In the latter years they shall come into the land that is brought back from the sword. So when Russia invades Israel, that is dwelling safely, this leads many to suggest that there must be some kind of comprehensive peace agreement made between Israel and her enemies, to such an extent that Israel in fact dismantles the wall that has been built and also the security checkpoints. Perhaps that will be the case, but it's also very possible to see the situation described in Ezekiel 38 that we see now. Before we looked at dwelling safely in unwalled villages as in that context, there's another passage that's worth looking at in Ezekiel 13. Now in Ezekiel 13, we've got an introduction to a very similar theme. In verse 10 we read, because they have seduced my people, saying peace, and there was no peace, and one built up a wall, and lo, and others daubed it with untempered mortar. Say unto them which daub it with untempered mortar, that it shall fall, there shall be an overflowing shower, and ye, O great hailstones, shall fall, and a great stormy wind shall rend it. Lo, when the wall is fallen, shall it not be said unto you, where is the daubing wherewith ye have daubed it? Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, I will even rend it with a stormy wind in my fury, and there shall be an overflowing shower in my anger, and great hailstones in my fury to consume it. So will I break down the wall that ye have daubed with untempered mortar, and bring it down to the ground, so that the foundation thereof shall be discovered, and it shall fall, and ye shall be consumed in the midst thereof, and ye shall know that I am the Lord. So we've had the following key points. The people in Israel have been seduced. The seductive message is one of peace. Then a wall is built with, as it's described in Ezekiel here, untempered mortar. That means an unsecure wall, a wall of temporary significance. But it doesn't lead to any peace. And of course, that's what we've seen develop, and furthermore, especially this year. We note that it is God that destroys the wall, and he destroys that with hailstones and storms. And of course, that kind of destruction will be complete and ultimate when that wall comes down. And so Israel's leader, they built that wall. One of their ambitions was that would bring peace. And the leaders promised, quoting them, after 35 years of living with the Palestinians and facing this blatant, ugly, terrorist wave, Israel has no choice but to put up a barrier as an important element in an overall defensive system that would intercept those on their way to blow themselves up amongst us. And that was the minister or Knesset minister since 1984, Minister Uzi Landau, who serves as the minister in the Prime Minister's office and of Internal Security. So the land was divided. These events were precisely as described in Ezekiel 13. Now, let's just come back to Ezekiel 38. It shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, that my fury shall come up into my face, and I will rain upon him and upon his bands and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain, in verse 22, and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. So in identical language to Ezekiel 13, we have God saying that in his fury, he's going to stop Gog in his tracks using storm and hailstones. It's exactly the same Hebrew word used in Ezekiel 13. The two passages are talking about, I believe, the same event. It's not a peace agreement that enables Israel to dismantle the wall that they have built. It is God in his fury that brings that about when Gog descends, the Russian host descends, and therefore I don't believe we'll see any more than a very tenuous peace in Israel. So, of course, what he does talk about is the unwalled villages, and of course we've seen that typically. In Ezekiel's time, of course, the villages were surrounded by rock walls to protect them from enemies. However, Israel, as we mentioned, with the use of kibbutzim and other community-based things, have used a very, very effective way of dealing and securing their territory. So we have confidence on the one hand, yet on the other, it is clearly a misguided confidence, and of course it will be God that deals with their invading army in the form of Russia. And that's just another little interesting development in Israel as we see the accuracy of Ezekiel 38 and 13 being expressed there. But we've been talking about a sort of temporary peace. And this is actually an interesting article this year when Bibi, known as Benjamin Netanyahu to most of the world, was in Lithuania to visit the grave of his parents and grandparents. And of course his statement was, what's the point of negotiating for peace when Israel gains without it? And of course, as people have questioned the fact that as America makes one concession after another to Israel, it seems impossible that they'll even start to try and make peace. Only this week, they've, I think, in the UN, they've offered an olive branch to Abbas again. To try and do that. And just out of interest, I was given this Australian Jewish News just prior to the lecture, and of course he's been up in the UN talking about the development of Iran's secret atomic warehouse. And that article is very, very interesting, and it underlines the concern that Israel have got for that. There's been a lot of noise about it over the last year, but in actual fact he's now come out and said that only in the last week or so. And stated unequivocally that of course they will be looking for support from various people in that endeavour because of the nuclearisation of Iran. The Bible talks in Zechariah about about Israel being a cup of poison. It explains it as though anybody that touches it is going to get poisoned and become part of the trouble that is in the Middle East. And as Bible students, the Middle East will not be resolved, the peace in the Middle East will not be resolved until, of course, the events of Ezekiel 38 and Joel 3 take place. Well, what do we need to do? And of course here I think, despite, I was just going to mention quickly about the kind of turmoil that's in Australian politics, 7 changes in Prime Minister over 11 years, that's rather unusual. But the commentary this week from an ex-Prime Minister was that actually it was the fracturing, and I think this probably explains it better, the fracturing of conservative politics and the dismissal of that probably from Australia. But the question is, what do we need to do about it, and what should we do? Well, back in Luke 21, the Lord gave us a solution. And for those that are looking at those events and thinking whatever could go wrong next, we have this assurance that when these things come to pass, in verse 28 of Luke 21, when they begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws nigh. And of course the word redemption is an Old English word that we don't use much. It actually talks about the amount paid to release somebody from slavery. So whatever is binding us, our fears, whether they're our concerns, our redemption is actually drawing nigh. And just like Joel said in the end of Joel chapter 3 that we read earlier, there will be a time when Judah will stay in its land forever, and Jesus Christ proclaimed that these signs in the sun, moon and the stars, in the leadership, in the luminaries, we might say, of the current world, are part of a development of what will happen. Men's hearts failing them for fear, for looking after those things which are coming. In fact, the Bible predicts a time when there will be a high level of anxiety, a high level of concern as to what's happening in our world. And of course, the powers in heaven and earth will be shaken to a point that will introduce the righteous rule of Jesus Christ to the earth. Our interest in presenting Bible facts is to provide comfort, to provide a hope that these things will be resolved and that you can be part of the plan that God has for the world. Thank you.